Zoom interviews with authors and readers. I would like to begin tonight by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara people, the traditional owners of the land where I am zooming in from tonight. I also acknowledge that each of you in Australia and perhaps even overseas are on land belonging to other Indigenous groups. Wherever you are, you can be sure that many before you have gathered for thousands of years to celebrate storytelling, just as we're doing tonight, and we recognise all elders and their continuing connection to the land. Social media is a vital tool in the fight to keep authors, publishers and booksellers thriving, so please feel free to take screenshots, publish tweets or post on Facebook or other platforms about tonight's event. Avid can be tagged on Twitter at avidreader4101. Tonight I'm very pleased to be chatting to Lauren Chater, author of the best-selling historical novels The Lace Weaver and Gulliver's Wife, as well as the baking compendium, Well-Read Cookie. In 2018, Lauren was awarded a grant by the Nilma Sydney Literary Fund to travel to the Netherlands to research her third novel, The Winter Dress, inspired by a real 17th century gown found off the Dutch coast in 2014. In Gulliver's Wife, published by Simon & Schuster, Lauren reimagines the lives of the women in Lemuel Gulliver's life, his wife Mary and his teenage daughter Bess, when he reappears from his astonishing and unbelievable travels in 1702. The narrative includes midwifery, murder, madness and magic through a tale of love, desire, birth and death. Welcome, Lauren, to our Zoom interview.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this Q&A with me. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. I know there's a lot of people interested to hear about the book, but first of all, I wanted to say that in your bio, it also states that in your spare time, you love baking, obviously, and listening to your children tell their own stories. And I was wondering how you're coping with currently launching a book in this surreal time of global pandemics, toilet paper shortages, stress baking, and homeschooling.
Yes, a disaster, isn't it? It's not at all easy to be launching a book in this time, and certainly completely unexpected. It's just not what you imagine when you working on your book and you think one day I'm going to see it on the shelf, and then you get to the bookshop and it's actually closed or it's just closed at the front and you can see it but you can't touch it or take photos of it or anything like that. But needs change, and I think it's not the most important thing that's happening. Obviously there are a lot more serious and grave things happening globally than just the loss of a book. But for me personally, I do think it's a kind of small baby grief, just that I had all these expectations of seeing it, and now really the only way that I get to see it is hold it myself. But I really have been very heartened by the community and the warmth of the literary community in helping out, and obviously places like Avid Reader running these events are completely invaluable for authors who have had cancelled events and festivals cancelled and things like that. So really appreciate it.
Well, just hold up your beautiful book again so we can get a proper look.
There it is.
The cover. It is actually a stunning cover, and tonight is all about Gulliver's Wife. So let's focus on that. Most of the listeners out there will have heard the story of Gulliver's Travels and his adventures with the tiny Lilliputian people.
Yes, the Lilliputians.
The Lilliputians. But have you ever wondered, audience, what happened when Lemuel Gulliver returned home with his extraordinary tales? How did his family and friends react to his fantastical stories? How did his wife cope, firstly with the news of his loss and presumed death at sea, and then with the return of the man into the life that she had rebuilt without him? Lauren, could you tell us a little bit about how you've reimagined this family's circumstances for the novel?
Sure. So a few years ago, I was working in my local library, which is Sutherland Library, which is just over the other side. I'm at my sister's house. And I was trying to read my way through all the books in the section titled 1001 Books to Read Before You Die. And I never made it through all of them. But one of the great things to come out of it was that I reread Gullivers Travels by Jonathan Swift. And so Gullivers Travels is the story of Lemuel Gulliver, who was a sailor surgeon, and he goes off to sea and has all these fantastic adventures, meeting all these strange creatures and exploring distant lands. And then he comes home to his family, who he never really thinks of unless they're in his immediate vicinity. And so the story is actually, it's very, very clever because it's actually a satire and it's political commentary about the time period and sort of questioning who were really the civilized people. Was it England, the English, or was it, the people that whose lands they had invaded? And so when I was reading the story, I was just struck by the fact that Mary Burton, who is Lemuel's wife, was given such a short amount of page space when really they're supposed to have this sort of intimate life together, and they obviously have a history, and yet he really only thinks of her when he is in her presence, and she remains this sort of anchor point for him to society. And at the end of the story, he's gone a little bit mad anyway and become a bit misanthropic. He prefers the company of his horses to his wife. And so I thought, I just think there's a story there, and I really wanted to explore what life might be like for the women left behind to care for their children and their families when the men just went off gallivanting to sea. And also, I wanted to explore 18th century midwifery. My mum is a midwife, and I really had no interest in babies at all until I had my son. And then I realised this amazing role that midwives play in society, and they do this great work. And so I wanted to explore the legacy of that a little bit and understand how midwives managed to survive through the centuries.
Yeah, I want to ask you get into a bit more detail about midwives a bit further on. But before we do that, I just wanted to commend you on the writing, the actual writing of the novel. It's beautifully crafted. It's very literary. The language is gorgeous. And I was wondering if you'd like to read a short passage for us, just to give us a sense of the tone of what we can expect.
I'll read just the first chapter. So there's a prologue and then there's this little chapter, but this is Mary's chapter. So this is set in Wapping in London, and it's April 1702. Widow Gulliver, is it true your husband once saw a monster? Everybody turns and Mary's cheeks grow hot under the hawkish scrutiny of a dozen pairs of eyes. The confinement room above Stewart's bakery seethes with gossips. Some are Sal Stewart's neighbours, but others hail from further afield. Sal's sister, for instance, who has travelled from Dorset on the coach. Ranged about on sofas and chairs, they are waiting, expectant, wine glasses half raised to parted lips. Mary frowns at the bed where she is knuckle-deep in Sal's privities. The presence of gossips is an unfortunate necessity. Should Sal's infant die, their testimony will protect her from whispers of murder and witchcraft. Mary is so used to performing her tasks in front of an audience that the intrusion of voices doesn't often bother her. Today, she wonders if the benefit is worth the fuss. Perhaps, she mutters, I cannot say. I wasn't there. The gossips explode, all of them talking at once, reminding her of a fire that broke out 6 months ago at the builder's yard. How swiftly that single column of flame multiplied, flaring over and over, until every man was hacking at the burning rigs in their timber cradles to save the ships before they burned. The women toss questions at her. How big was the monster? What did it look like? How did he fight it off? I don't know, she says, or I can't presume. When they tire of the subject, talk turns to other things. Queen Anne's impending coronation, the Spanish War, the treacherous French, the soaring cost of sugar. Poor Sal, sweltering on the bed, is all but forgotten. How are you faring, Mary says. Beneath her hands, Sal's body shudders. Sweat slicks her face and neck. She wears a man's knee-length cotton shirt, her breasts splayed beneath the thin fabric, nudged aside by her belly's heaving swell. Not long now. Mary smears the blood and mucus from her fingers onto a clean clout. Sal struggles onto her elbows. You felt it, the child. Yes, he's a good head of hair on him. I hope you've trimmed enough bonnets. Sal's face breaks open in a smile before the pain begins to build and she must succumb to the spasmodic urges of her body. Mary tracks her movements with a sharp eye. This is the second child Mary has helped Sal birth. She remembers the first, a white-skinned poppet who, despite Mary's fervent ministrations, never opened her eyes in this life. Sal's grief-struck keening haunted her for weeks afterwards.
She couldn't help thinking of her own lost souls back in the early days of her marriage, their clotted endings in the chamber pot after a night of cramps. Many physicians, and even some midwives, consider a lifeless child a gross aberration, but Mary has never thought it so. Each child, however tiny, however imperfectly formed, is human in her eyes, each worthy of its mother's love.
Oh, thank you. That was beautiful, beautiful. And it really sets the tone for what's to come in the book. So tell us a little bit about Mary and her role as a midwife and a herbalist. What did that involve in the 18th century?
So Mary is a midwife. She's progressed up the training system. So midwives of the 18th century, unlike their sort of counterparts in regional towns and villages where they were much more susceptible to accusations of witchcraft, in London they had a really solid training system and a hierarchy, and they were sanctified by the church. And so they were able to then baptize children who weren't going to survive and things like that. So that was the purpose of or sort of ordaining them in that sense. They had a training system, so young girls would be apprentices, and then they would move to deputies, and then they would finally become midwives. And midwives could actually make like a pretty decent amount of money working, especially if you amazingly, managed to get to the court and to deliver babies for royalty, obviously, and rich clients. A lady called Doreen Evenden a couple of years ago in the 1990s wrote a really wonderful book. Actually, I have it here. It's called The Midwives of 17th Century London. And she was sort of the first academic to write about these women, and she spent all this time in the British Library. She pulled all their names out. They had never been named before that because the male practitioners obviously cast them in this light where they were sort of saying that they were uneducated and that they were lay women, and because they wanted to make themselves look really good, and so that was the first time that anyone had ever compiled all their names, and she put their names together with the parishes, and then she also had a list of the wills, and the wills had all the obviously the fees that they would charge. So then she knew how much they were making. And they all used to wear these red cloaks. So they would wear these red capes, like Little Red Riding Hood, and they would it would be this beacon for women. So if they saw them coming, to the bedchamber, they would know that they were kind of safe, and they were able to move around in London and places like that. And
it's a bit Handmaid's Tale, isn't it? The red.
It is a bit Handmaid's Tale.
So what was a normal day like for a midwife back then? And tell us a bit about what conflicts the midwives had at around that time, the time that your story is set, with society and particularly with the medical profession.
Yeah, sure. So midwives would have had a really full day of travelling to clients' houses. They would probably have walked, or they would have taken a barge, across the river, the Thames. At that time, it was mostly that was how you got around, or you would have a sedan chair, but they probably wouldn't have had enough money to do that. And so there was a big responsibility for midwives because nobody wanted to be accused of sort of killing children or doing a bad job, and hence why the gossips were included in the sort of ritual of giving birth. And so you would give birth in front of 10 or 15 women, and they might be your friends, or you can imagine now your friends or your family, and they would testify, and that would help the midwife as well, so that she wasn't accused of any sort of nefarious dealings. And some of the things that they were up against, obviously all the things that we still experience, sort of prejudice existed then, and in particular the male surgeons wanted to get in on a bit of this action because the midwives were doing so well and they were so respected in the parish by the women, and the midwives, the surgeons, invented the forceps. So a family called the Chamberlains, they had fled France, and they were French surgeons. They came to live in London, and they brought this secret weapon with them, this secret instrument, which was the forceps. And they actually kept it hidden for 150 years because they didn't want anyone else to know what they were doing and how they were saving babies, even though there was obviously massive risk to women if they weren't well trained, if the surgeons weren't trained. They used to bring it in a box, and then they would blindfold the women, and they would play bells in her ears so she couldn't see what was going on. It must have been terrifying, absolutely terrifying. But so they wanted in on this really good deal that the midwives were getting, and so they started using the forceps, and they were finally then admitted to the bedchamber. So there was this struggle going on, and I wanted to position Mary at the forefront of that struggle.
Well, you really do that really well. In fact, that whole aspect of the book just completely had me enthralled. The vocational nature of the midwives, their training, the conflicts they had with the doctors. It's all just really so fascinating. Do you think we've come a long way from 1702, or do you think that birth is still a really divisive societal issue?
Yeah, I think it is a really divisive issue. I mean, depending on how much money you have, privilege, it all makes a huge difference, of course, in terms of where you give birth, how you give birth, but even just the basic right of women to be able to choose how they give birth. That's still a really contentious issue today. And reproductive rights are obviously incredibly contentious and important, and we only have to look at sort of the abortion laws and how long it's sort of taken for us to get to that point to decriminalise abortion, that the women's bodies are still completely policed and at the mercy of the medical profession, really. I know that they want to do a good job, and that there are lots of altruistic reasons, but there are, of course, lots of political reasons why things happen as well. And so certainly for me, growing up and seeing my mum in that situation, and I obviously, as I said, I had never really paid much attention to what she did until I had my child, and then I understood that midwives do this incredibly important job. And so I really wanted to pay tribute to that in the story as well.
Yeah, it's a very interesting aspect of the story. But getting back to the actual story of Gulliver's Travels. So what you've done is that you've really cleverly taken an imaginary character and then retold a classic tale with more reimagined characters. So what were some of the advantages and disadvantages in writing with those sort of restrictions or parameters, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The first sort of drafts that I did, I think I made Gulliver too nice. I was maybe too sympathetic towards him. And then I read some critical analysis of Gulliver's Travels and some sort of feminist readings, and I thought, no, this is the story. I mean, it has to be Mary's story. He's had all these years to tell his side of the story. So there were both. There were things that were definitely advantages, like having the setting. Obviously, that was easy to research. At least I knew the date, and I decided to set it between the first adventure and the second adventure. He goes to 4 different islands during the travels, but I just thought that would just be too long. So I did consider playing with it and making it sort of from her birth to her death. It just would have been epic and just too big. And the whole point of the story was for me to show that women's domestic lives were just as important, and that they lived really full, incredibly rich lives, despite the fact that they maybe weren't off on ships having adventures. And so it was really important for me to do that. I also did a lot of research about Swift himself and tried to incorporate some of his characteristics with Lemuel Gulliver's, because when it was originally published, it was published anonymously, because he knew he was going to get into lots of trouble with Queen Anne, because there's a queen in the story, and she's very obviously Queen Anne. And eventually Swift did get exiled back to Ireland. You know, he did lose face and friends and the Queen's support, because he was making a critical commentary on the English and the way that they treated, other civilizations and their colonies. And so I wanted to put some of his characteristics into the story as well. So he was a real stickler for hand washing and cleanliness, which these days is seeming very appealing.
Ahead of his time.
I know, he was so ahead of his time, but he was a little bit, strange, and everyone thought that was really strange anyway. I think he used to wash his hands like 3 times a day, but people thought that was really out there. And he also was very sensitive to smell.
He was very sensitive to smells. He didn't like bad smells, and he was a wit. You know, he was fantastic. So he used to sort of write off anonymous critiques of his arch nemesis, his literary nemesis, in the papers and things like that. So he was a fascinating man. So I did kind of want Gulliver to be an interesting person, even if not particularly likable. He is a man of his time. He's a man of that intersection between religion and science and sort of paganism and folklore. And I wanted to put all those elements in the book. And so I hope that I did do that.
Yeah, I think you. Yeah, you did. And I think it's interesting that even though Gulliver takes a bit of a backseat in the story, you still explore his sort of life as a seafarer. And there's another character, Casper, in the book, who's also a sailor. And you do give some information about their sort of life. But very rightly, we're concentrating on Mary and Bess. Mary's actually a bit relieved that her husband hasn't returned from sea when he doesn't come back. He's not easy to live with, as you've intimated, and his unexpected return is sort of a bit of a shock for everybody. How did you sort of imagine your way into Mary's mind to explore what her reaction would be to those changed circumstances? Firstly, when he disappears and she's left alone, and then secondly, when he reappears and suddenly she's a wife again rather than an independent woman.
Yeah, so the original drafts that I did, the first couple of drafts, weren't as rich and filled out. Of course, that usually comes later. And so it was quite a quick intro. I think if I remember correctly, it was just straight into the story. He was returned, and then you sort of had to see the fallout. But then in later drafts, I added in that backstory because my editor felt that it was important to give the idea so that people would know what had happened beforehand. And so Mary marries Gulliver for really financial reasons, because women couldn't really earn a living any other way, and it's really that choice for her whether she wants to continue on and become a midwife or to get married and maybe have that security. But then of course it turns out that being married to Gulliver is not really that secure anyway. And so I think that was the situation. I can imagine that was the situation for a lot of women at that time. The idea of divorce, the idea that after Henry VIII, broke off from the church, that women could just get divorced, that's just fallacy. That just didn't happen. It was so expensive to get divorced, firstly. And if you did eventually manage to get divorced, the men took everything. In those days, men had the right to take your children and all your money and everything, even your inheritance if you were lucky to have one. So for me, that really left Mary with no choice except to either marry or live in poverty. And so she's very lucky in that she manages to continue with her midwifery once Gulliver goes off to sea and then supposedly loses his life, and she builds up her reputation as a midwife, and this widowhood is almost a protection for her in a sense. And so I think maybe a lot of women might have really enjoyed that status, not having to worry about the man coming back. And one of the other characters as well, Anne Clifton, she's also a widow, and so I wanted to put that in there, that it might have been a sort of a protection status for women, and they might not have been too unhappy about it.
And the relationship between Mary and her adolescent daughter Bess is also really well drawn and is sort of explored with all the complex feelings that we recognise today. A lot of the feelings don't seem to have changed 300 years later. Why was it important for you to explore that relationship in such depth? And how does Bess's attitude towards her mother change throughout the book? I don't want you to give anything away, but how or why does her attitude towards her mother change?
Yeah, so Bess was a character that I think she's secretly my favourite character. I think there's a lot of me in Bess, but then I'm also a lot more compliant than Bess is. Bess is really curious, and she has this natural curiosity, some could say morbidity, and sort of a morbid obsession about death, and an interest in where souls go after they die, and what becomes of matter and things like that. And so she also has a really adventurous streak, and she wants to go to sea with her father, and she has been brought up to believe that she will one day go to sea. And as per Gulliver's fantastic sort of storytelling nature, he has plied her with all these stories, and she has believed him. And so, oh, you've just frozen now.
Sorry.
Yeah,
You're back.
Yeah, so she's always believed that she was going to go to sea, and obviously that's not the case as time goes on. Women were not permitted to go to sea, and so Bess really has to adjust her feelings and her idea of what her future might be to what is permissible within that society. I didn't want to write a real revisionist storyline that wasn't true to what women were allowed to do at that time, and so I had to keep it within the confines of history. And so Bess finds it difficult to get along with her mother, but they have a common, they find a common ground with midwifery, and Bess sort of, her transformation and growth is perhaps even more than Mary's in a sense, because she's 15 and she's right on the cusp of learning who it is that she wants to be, or exploring who she wants to be.
And sort of working her way into adulthood and understanding adult issues a bit better, maybe.
Yes, and marriage. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but a lot of my sort of building around Mary and Bess, around Mary and Gulliver's relationship, like I took from my own family, and I remember my parents having this terrible sort of fight when I was 16, and just suddenly realizing that their marriage was not what I thought it had been, it was. And so I think that's a really pivotal moment as well for teenagers, to understand that their parents are both human, and that relationships are complex and fluid and not stable.
True.
Yeah.
Just changing tack a bit here. So we do have some elements of magic realism in the novel, but it's done with such a beautiful light touch that it's almost barely there, but it's there. So Lemuel is either suffering delusions and he's mad, or he has experienced something really rare and magical. How did you balance that sense of the surreal with the pragmatism of reality?
Yeah, it was difficult, but I wanted to have those elements of magic and sort of mystery in the story, because it was obviously a time of incredible discovery. You know, people were going to sea, and they were imagining that they'd seen sea monsters, and they still believed in mermaids, and you could pay, 5 shillings and go and see a fairy in a shop, but of course it wasn't really a fairy, it was just a sort of stuffed doll, and it was dressed up. But people had this superstitious nature, and so I really wanted to get that in there, that it was a time when people could believe anything. And I think it's really interesting with the whole aspect of fake news that we now see, and misinformation. It has a resonance there with what we're still experiencing, and perhaps have experienced a lot in the last few years, particularly with America and Trump, and trying to work out what's real and what's not, and work out where our ideology sits when there's just this huge torrent of information. Even though it was 1700, there was a lot of gossip. There were stories coming from overseas, and they had pamphlets, and there was political parties always trying to get you to riot with them, because, the bakers wanted more money. They were starving. And so it was just like a really brutal time. But I think those elements of wonder are really important to the story, because they keep you reading and they keep you guessing, like, is he really or is he not? And it's kind of the appeal of the original Gullivers Travels too, I think, in a way. You can never really be sure, especially when he's at home at the end of the story talking to his horses, and you think, well, did he really imagine all that stuff that he was just but yeah, you just never really know, and Swift never really tells you.
Yeah, and you do that really well in the book. And I love that you just managed to get Trump and fairies and mermaids all into your same answer. That was really clever.
Oh, he's just shocking, isn't he?
Yeah, let's not go there.
Yeah, let's not.
So in this novel, you really awaken all of our senses. So we're completely immersed in the visceral grittiness of this time when the book is set. The smells, the sounds, the tastes of the era. As a writer, how do you convey those senses so evocatively so that you can place the reader firmly in that environment?
It's one of the things that I really love about writing. I love the visceral and the real and the sensory. I like bringing readers in, drawing them in with those elements, and I think it's really important for scene setting and for people to, especially if you're writing historical, you know, people need to know where they are in the story because they can't imagine what it would be like in 1700 without those little prompters. And so yeah, I don't know, some people have said that it's quite dark, and I was, really, is it that dark? Okay, it is dark, but life was so dark back then, you know, it was so brutal. And I think to write a sort of light romantic version of it would have been inauthentic and completely false. So particularly with the midwifery, you know, these were very close rooms, and because of the superstitious elements, you know, they wouldn't open the windows or anything like that. So there would be a big fire and it would be hot, and you can just imagine the kind of smells that would be there. And these are people who were used to smells. So yeah, and it's just I also wanted to get in a lot of the wharves and the Wapping docks, because where the Gulliver family live in the Needle, they live right next to the execution docks, and that's where they used to hang the pirates. And so one of Bess's obsessions is to go down and see the hung bodies of the pirates. You know, these were people who lived side by side with death all the time, and so it's like really important to get that into the story, I think, and weave that kind of thing through. Particularly with the midwifery, I asked my mum a lot about the actual sensation of watching someone give birth, because I don't think I've never watched anyone give birth. I've given birth myself, but it's quite different when you're on the other side of it. And so she described a lot of those things for me. And
you bookend the story actually with a birth at the beginning and a birth at the end. Both of them very visceral and very sort of immersive, descriptive passages, which I think really add to that sense of everybody living with birth, death, and wonder, as it says on the cover.
Yeah.
I keep saying this is a beautifully crafted story, and it is, but it's also quite fast-paced and full of intrigue, suspicion, forbidden love, thwarted ambition, and yearning, so much yearning. All of the characters are yearning for something or someone that is just out of their reach. As you're writing, what important elements do you keep bringing yourself back to in order to keep the story accessible and engaging for readers, as well as being beautiful writing?
Yeah, I try to see everything through the eyes of my character. So a lot of the early drafts are they're very scattered, and the writing's sort of all over the shop. But then as you refine down through the drafts, you're basically just making that voice clearer through the story. And so each character has a voice, and and the overall story has that narrative voice. And so it's more just about tuning out all the excess noise, which could be, you know, excess descriptions or just things that are completely unimportant to the story and are not adding tension or any sort of having a purpose. So I just try to get rid of all that so that it's just what's the character doing and what are they seeing and what are they feeling, and that to me is the driving pace of the story. So, you know, it's nice to have really nice writing, but there's no point if it's like a garnish. If it's just too much, you know, it just feels like overdone. So I hope that it doesn't feel that way. I wanted to, it's like, you know, lightening it and smoothing down all the edges. And so
it's very well balanced. It's like
good.
A finely balanced meal.
It's very hard to get it to that point, as you know.
Well, you've done a good job. So ultimately, I guess really this is the story of the determination and gumption of women at a time when they were considered not much more than property. How do you think that resonates for women today? How do you think that story set 300 years ago is relevant and resonates with us today?
Yeah, I hope people do find that it resonates with them, because obviously, as I said, the issues are still incredibly relevant today. We still have huge amounts of domestic violence in our country, and need to protect those women. And so one of Mary's jobs is to check on, her clients, especially the ones who are vulnerable and have those sort of histories. And in one case, she defends her client against sort of drunken husband. But so I think it is really important for us all to look after each other, and particularly now with the global pandemic. And I think, it's really hard to say. I think that women would find that their own lives really resonate with Mary's, in that she's a domestic working woman as well. She's a working woman, but she also has this domestic life and these children that she needs to care for, and having to navigate that role is incredibly difficult, as especially those of us who are homeschooling are finding.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think that the way that the book is written, it shows the parallels and the similarities between 1700 and now more than the differences.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, that's good.
Look, I have lots more questions, but Chrissy, I'm not sure how many questions you've got coming in from the audience. So
questions from the audience. So I might ask a few of them then. One of them was from Laura Elvery, actually, that the original Gullivers Travels was satire, and it was very funny. And she was wondering whether you kind of were tempted to use satire, or whether you moved away from that, particularly, if you intended to move away from that.
It's a great question. I did contemplate writing a satire, but it's extremely hard to write satire, and the other thing about satire is that it's very of the moment. And so Swift's he's very lucky in that his book has survived 300 years, but a lot of satire, if you read it now, in 10-15 years time, it's kind of irrelevant. And so I wanted really to write something that might be more accessible to people, and to get them to go back and read Swift's book as well, to encourage them to read it. And so I wrote it from a more sort of serious perspective, but there are some funny elements in it as well. I mean, it's dark, but it's also got some humour, because what is life without humour?
Great. Another question here from Fiona Stager. What does your mum think about the book?
Yeah, she's a tough customer, my mum, actually. She doesn't read my work until it's published, and she did read this one. So when I asked her, she said, oh yeah, I really liked it, but I think she was touched by the dedication, because I did dedicate it to her. I really obviously appreciated all her help after I had my kids, and still do. And so I hope that she'll share it around with all her friends. We'll have to see.
What another question here has asked from Bronwyn, what advice would they give today's midwives and doulas, do you think? What advice, what can you take from the previous generations of it?
It's a really good question, isn't it? I feel like they all kind of connect into, there's this sort of organic idea behind childbirth that really hasn't changed all that much, especially with my mum and her fellow midwives are concerned. They're very encouraging of natural birth and no drugs, and but of course things sometimes don't go to plan, so they're really open to that. And I wonder if maybe the midwives of the 17th century would say, prepare for the unexpected, and you never know what's going to happen. I remember my mum saying that because she'd been working in midwifery for so long, that she could tell when someone was going to have a heart attack or a hemorrhage and things like that. So I think they get this sixth sense as well about what's going to happen, and that they just hone that over years of experience as well.
And how did you go about working out Mary's voice and to keep it of the time, but also accessible to a contemporary reader?
I did a lot of reading of texts at that time period. So some of the books that I read were like, this one is called The Midwives book, or The Whole Art of Midwifery Discovered. It's by Jane Sharp. She was the first midwife to write and publish her own book. People don't know much about her. You know, history has not remembered her very well, but it's all written in her own language and reproduced. So you get that sense of how people might have spoken, and also how they might have thought about anatomy in the body. And it has sort of these incredible little diagrams as well that she drew herself, and they were published with it. And so it's got, beautiful, they're like little flowers, these sort of these petals unfurling, and you can see the baby like a little broccoli or something inside the stomach. And so they're just extraordinary. So I tried to read a lot of text from the time period just to get the idea of the voice, and also reread, of course, Gulliver's Travels quite a few hundred times, so that I could put little Easter egg surprises in the story for people who are familiar with the story.
There's actually a question that might even be for Cass, I think, which was, do you feel like you have to have read Gulliver's Travels before you read this, Cass?
No, definitely not. I sorry, but I haven't read Gulliver's Travels. Only, just heard about it. But no, you absolutely don't need to have read that. I think everybody knows, has heard a bit about the story. But I think even if you hadn't, even if it was completely new to you, I think you can still enjoy this book without knowing anything about Gulliver. It's self-explanatory.
Right. And from Kylie, the book made me want to travel to Wapping and walk down the wharves. Have you actually done this because it's so believable?
Yeah, I did. So I went twice to London and went to Wapping and walked all around the area. It does feel different, of course, because there's nothing sort of left from the 1700s, but the Thames is still there. So, if you're living on the river, you can imagine they're river people, and a lot of their interactions come from the river, and it's seasonal, and the pirates were there. So they still have the execution dock, it's still there. And you can see they've got a replica of sort of the little scaffold and the nooses and things like that. And they used to let the bodies would have to be washed over by the tide 3 times before they could be cut down and things like that. So it was really atmospheric. And one of the other great things I did was I went to Dennis Sever's house, which is this extraordinary sort of living diorama, and it's in Spitalfields in London. And when you walk in, it's all set up as though these 17th century silk weavers have just left the room, and all the smells are there. So they've got the oranges with the cloves, and there's no photos, there's no talking. There's only 5 people allowed at a time, and it's at night. So you can see how the light would fall, because the European light is so different to Australian light. And so that was an extraordinary experience as well. And if anyone ever goes to London, I highly recommend it.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
It was amazing.
So from Fiona Robertson, what is the most amazing thing you discovered during the research into this time?
It was probably I really enjoyed reading about the folklore and the superstitious elements of giving birth and the customs of giving birth. I just found that really fascinating. That, for example, if you looked at a cat, you would have a child that had a hairy face. There was a woman who used to pray in front of a portrait of John the Baptist, and then when her child was born, he was as hairy as a camel. I just love those stories. I think they're extraordinary, and the things that people wanted to believe about their lives, because they had no control, and there was so much disease, and the infant mortality rates were so high that they would do anything and try anything to alleviate some of that pain and give them some luck.
And there's a question here from, I think maybe Alicia is the name. How do you go about researching this stuff? I mean, you've talked about the books, and you've also talked about traveling. What are they? Is that the main way you were able to research?
Yeah, I think the books first, and then I would go. But also there are, resources you can find. There's so many museums. The British Museum, the British Library, all have really interesting sort of stories about this time period. And also the libraries, they had these amazing maps. So I asked the Tower Hamlets Library if they had any maps at the time, and they just pulled out these sort of 17th century replicas of the 17th century maps, but they kept such good records. So you could see what Wapping looked like, you know, and the geography of it, and that there was an orchard here, and that sort of thing. So that was mainly it. And also the clothing. So I spoke to a lot of clothing historians, especially about maternity dress and maternity clothing. And because people were so poor, they used to just let out their normal clothes and then they would just restitch them afterwards, which makes sense when you think about it. But it was those little things as well with the costumes that I wanted to get right.
Fantastic. There's a question here which is about since the publication of your book, have you been surprised by anything that readers have brought to the story, or have there been any surprises at all since the publication of your book? I suppose apart from the fact that we're all locked in our house.
Yeah. That is very odd. I suppose it's just, the fact that people find it so dark and so visceral. And I just think, oh, but this is my imagination. And I'm surprised at that. But then I guess not everyone has that kind of, that sort of interest in death and the visceral side of the human body and things like that. But I do, and so I'm hoping that it will connect with readers. And I do find that people are enjoying it. But like a friend of mine read it, and she said it has a dark energy. So you meant it in a complimentary way, but I kind of like that. You know, it's a story about women and women's issues, and so I don't mind that it has that dark energy.
I have to say that even though there is that darkness in it, that's lightened by the other things that you've mentioned, the folklore, the bit of magic realism, all of that sort of, I think, balances it well.
Yeah.
I didn't find it a dark read.
Oh, that's good.
Myself.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, that's good.
There's a couple of questions that are sort of related to each other, so I'll ask them together. One of them was, have you heard about the book Touching Distance? Is that a book that you've come across?
No, I'd love to know more about it.
I think maybe that's a book that you might like to think about putting into your reading list, because one of the readers here has said, asked you about it in relation to your book. But the other question that is relating to that is about the books that did inspire you when you were writing this. Was it just the midwifery book that you held up before? Are there other fictional books that inspired you, or non-fictional books?
Yeah, so obviously the midwifery manuals were really helpful. I read a lot of Aphra Behn's plays when I was researching. She was a 17th century playwright, and she was kind of a feminist of her time, and quite a staunch feminist. And so it was really great to get her voice, to hear her voice exactly as it might have sounded. The great thing about plays is that you can read them out loud, you know, and then you can hear for yourself from the dialogue how these people spoke. I was reading, as I was writing, The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which I really enjoyed. It's the story of the Trojan women, but told from their perspective. And one of the Trojan princesses is married off to Achilles. And I just loved the book, and I thought it was extraordinary, the way that you got the sense of the outer world of men at war. These women were in the laundry and they were laying out the bodies, you know, oh, I'm getting shivers. Yeah, they were laying out the bodies of the men, and they were talking and they were gossiping, and also they were surviving. They were incredible survivors because they were sex slaves and they were stuck with these men who had killed, you know, their fathers and their brothers, and they somehow had to navigate that relationship. And so I really connected to that idea of women being enslaved in a sense, even though, of course, in Mary's case, she's married. But for her, that is a kind of bondage. And so that was a really influential book as well. I also love Emma Donohue's books. I love everything that she's written. I think she's just an extraordinary writer. And so I read The Woman Who Gave Birth to Rabbits, which is a series of short stories that she wrote. And that particular one is the title story. the title piece from the book, and it's about a woman from the 17th century who said that she gave birth to rabbits, and all these medical doctors from miles around came and inspected her, and everyone thought it was this extraordinary wonder, but of course it was all a big hoax, and actually her husband had just been skinning them and she'd just been puffing. So that was a great one too.
So someone has said, I think it's more a comment, but an interesting one, Cassie Hammer said, the darkness in the book is simply a reflection of the times. In the 18th century London was a difficult place for women. So
Yeah, I agree.
Comment there.
Yeah.
Somebody else has asked you a little bit more about your own life, that she wanted to hear a little bit more about the books that maybe inspired you to start writing in the first place.
Yeah, sure. So I've always been a huge reader, but it wasn't until sort of maybe my mid-20s that I started taking it really seriously and wanting to read not just for interest, but to understand how books worked. And so obviously some of the first historical books that I read were Geraldine Brooks's books. You know, I loved Year of Wonders, which everybody seems to be rereading now. And my sister and I loved Alice Hoffman when we were younger. We loved stories of sort of witchy power and feminism. Some of the other writers that I really enjoy are obviously Hilary Mantel. I think she's extraordinary, and I'm almost finished her latest book, which is the only silver lining of having this time to read. So I really love her writing as well, and I love what she does with textiles and texture when she writes about Cromwell from Cromwell's point of view. Yeah, so and I love Margaret Atwood as well. When I was reading the Silence of the Girls, I read the Penelope ad after that, and that just gave me the creeps, but I thought it was fantastic.
Oh, wonderful. Look, I'm sharing the link again to your book. I think after hearing, we've certainly had requests for you to read more, although we don't have time, unfortunately.
Sorry.
But you know, we've certainly had lots of comments that have been really positive about this chat, particularly about your reading and also about the content of the book. So I can tell that our audience has really enjoyed it. I am going to, at the end of this event, I'm going to open the room up so that people can give a last round of applause before we end. But I thought I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank Cass Moriarty, who did an excellent job with the questions.
Thank you, Cass. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for your insights. I think people will be really surprised and interested by what they read in the book. I certainly learnt a lot about midwifery, seafaring, all sorts of things.
Well, thank you for engaging with it so deeply. I really appreciate it.
Everybody buy a copy for yourself, buy one for your sister, buy one for your mother, buy one for your friend, buy one for your husband. Yeah, just everybody. Christmas list.
And that link I sent is the one that that you can actually buy them on. So we do run these events, and we do hope that in running these events that you do support us rather than any of the discounter stores that might be trying to hop in and compete and take some money away from the authors and the booksellers at this time. But on that sobering note, do follow Avid Reader. We have a full events program again. I'm so surprised that in a matter of 2.5 weeks, what was an empty slate in the new world suddenly is a very packed events program, and we're beginning to open up our craft program again. So if you're a writer, we have lots of craft workshops that are going to be coming up, and the first of those back in the calendar is actually a workshop by Cass Moriarty. So you can join Cass and talk about characters and character development. So do keep an eye on that. We'll be trying to keep you very much engaged with writers and writing in the upcoming months, and until we get let out, I suppose. And until then, please think about supporting all the books that got a bit cancelled in this time. So, and the first one of those that we're recommending, of course, is Gullivers Wife. So everyone, I'm going to unmute you. I will not be able to come back because it will be a cacophony of clapping and waving.
Hey. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Okay, well, listen, I'm going to have to go.
Thank you, Lauren.
Hey, Lauren.
Well done. Well done.
Right, Lauren.
Well done.
Excellent.
Congratulations.
Bye.
That's a boy.